Good morning, everyone. Happy Monday morning to you. Welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. I do appreciate you being with me, and we are continuing today our study of the feast days. We have been focused on Sukkot, the last of Israel's feast days. Sukkot was the Feast of Harvest, the Feast of Ingathering, the Feast of Resurrection, resurrection being ingathering. Paul's very clear in Colossians chapter 2, 16 and 17, that those feast days, the new moons, feast days, and Sabbaths, were, when he wrote in approximately 61 or 62 AD, they were still shadows of the good things that were about to come. The text does not say of the good things that had come. That's a mistranslation and a wrong rendering of the Greek of the text. Now, this means that for those who say that in Colossians 2, Paul said the law itself was nailed to the cross, they're misunderstanding the text because that's not what it says. Go to my website, donkpreston.com, and in the search bar, look up Dallas Burdett on Colossians chapter 2. Dr. Burdett does a deep dive into the linguistics of Colossians chapter 2, proving, as many scholars have noted, that Paul was not saying that the law itself was nailed to the cross. So do yourself a favor and go there and read that article. So what I've been sharing with you is that Sukkot represented the time of the harvest, because Sukkot was harvest itself. It was the ingathering. It was the last harvest of the year. You had a harvest at the beginning of the year. You had the first fruit then, and then you had what they call the vintage harvest. So, with Sukkot representing and symbolizing the ingathering, what it therefore represented in that representation of the eschatological fulfillment was the end of the charismata, because Paul's emphatic that the miraculous gifts were to endure until the day of the Lord. Well, what's the day of the Lord? Time of the harvest, right? That's the interplay. Day of the Lord, harvest, Matthew chapter 13, when the harvest would be gathered into the barn. So there's no question that Sukkot, as the Feast of Harvest, is related to eschatology and the day of the Lord. Well, that means that the miraculous gifts would end at the day of the Lord. Wherever that day of the Lord would be, and the majority of people who call themselves Christians today believe that's still in our future, at the end of time, the end of the Christian age, etc. If that's where you put the end of the age, then that's where you have to put the cessation of the miracles. So, with that, all of that in mind, and there's a whole lot more I could say on that to kind of bring us back up to speed, but as promised last week, pardon me, what I want to do today is to show you, as I've hinted at before, but even the Old Testament prophesied of the end of the charismatic gifts. Now, let's not forget something, because boy, this is so important. The Jews understood, it's all throughout the rabbinic writings. Scholars have documented this more times than you can count. The Jews believed that after the writing of the book of Malachi, after the revelation of the book of Malachi, the prophetic office ceased in Israel. I'm not going to take the time to document that. If you want documentation on that, I have it in both of these books. 70 weeks are determined for the resurrection and seal up vision and prophecy. I give all sorts of historical and scholarly documentation for that idea, for that fact, that it was strongly believed in ancient Israel that the prophetic office had ceased with Malachi. The office, the function of prophet had ceased. Now, that's not to say that there was no belief by anyone whatsoever that there were not men who were guided by the Spirit. That's true. They believed, some people did, they believed that the Maccabees were themselves led by the Holy Spirit. They did not believe that there were inspired prophets after the form of Malachi, Micah, Isaiah, Jeremiah. As a matter of fact, in the book of First Maccabees, it spoke of the time of the coming of a true prophet. So even the Maccabees understood that they were not prophets in that sense. Okay. So while there was the belief and understanding that the prophetic gift had ended with Malachi, there were in fact the Old Testament prophecies that in the last days God would renew the prophetic office. Joel chapter 2. It shall come to pass in the last days, pardon me, I will pour out my spirit upon all flesh. Your sons and your daughters shall prophesy. That's why it was so incredibly important, why it is so incredibly so incredibly important to see, number one, the ministry of John the Baptizer, who is a prophet according to Jesus. He was the greatest prophet who ever lived, according to Jesus. It is therefore incredibly important to put John's ministry in the last days, which means the last days didn't start on Pentecost, by the way. Secondly, this means it is incredibly important to understand what's going on the day of Pentecost, when Joel chapter 2 began to be fulfilled with the outpouring of the Holy Spirit. That meant that the last days were present. Doesn't mean they were beginning, because like I said, John was a prophet. He was full of the Holy Spirit, meaning the last days had begun. And they were in full force on the day of Pentecost. But in addition to the fact that the Holy Spirit was to be poured out again in the last days, and by the way, Isaiah 32, Ezekiel 37, Micah chapter 7 are just other passages that spoke of the renewal of the Holy Spirit in the last days. In the days of the salvation of Israel. Ezekiel 37 especially powerful on this. So anyway, there's so much I feel like I need to say on this, but I'm trying to keep this, within my normal confines of time. So, in addition to the prophecies of the renewal of the Spirit, the renewal of the prophetic office, then you find prophecies of the ultimate cessation of miracles. And as promised, last week, I want to go to Daniel chapter 9, 24 through 27. In this passage, which is one of the most popular, one of the most important of all Old Testament prophecies, in spite of the fact that some people say, oh, well, Daniel was not really a messianic prophet. By the way, some former preterists are now saying there was never a man by the name of Daniel who prophesied. the book of Daniel was not written by a prophet named Daniel. Yeah, he actually said that. Unless I totally misunderstood him. I don't think I did. But be that as it may. If I did, I'll correct it. Pure and simple. Okay, so Daniel chapter 9. 70 weeks are determined for your people and your holy city to remove sin, to make the atonement, to seal vision and prophecy. Now, what in the world did that mean? Well, in this book, Seal It, Vision, and Prophecy, that I wrote several years ago, and I've got a ton of material to add to it if I ever get the time, if I'm allowed the time, to add to this, to buttress and to reinforce everything that I said in this book. I document from across the scholarly world. It doesn't matter, amillennial, postmillennial, premillennial. Scholarship across the board admits and agrees and teaches that the Hebrew of seal, vision, and prophecy, I apologize, folks. I didn't realize I was having so much trouble with my voice when I got up this morning. I'll use my inhaler before I film my next video. Anyway, scholarship is agreed. I document it with quotation after quotation after quotation, as well as other citations of an additional 20 sources, that the Hebrew of the text means to bring the prophetic office to its end through the fulfillment of all prophecy. Do you catch the power of that? To bring the prophetic office to a close, putting an end to it, through the fulfillment of all prophecy. Now, are there some isolated cases out there? Well, in the higher critical world, they deny that. Because they said, well, what Daniel's concerned with is the fulfillment of one prophecy. Well, there is no definite article in the text that says to seal up the vision and the prophecy. No, there is no definite article there. And so, as the scholars point out, Daniel is being told about the fulfillment and the cessation of the prophetic office as a whole, comprehensively. Okay, so here we have a prophecy. This is what's fascinating. Here we have a prophecy of the cessation of the charismatic gifts, and that prophecy was given before the end of the prophetic office at the book of Malachi, and it was given before the fulfillment of the restoration of the prophetic office in fulfillment of Joel. This is really quite remarkable. So here's Joel, written long before Daniel, predicting the outpouring of the Holy Spirit in the last days. But here is Daniel predicting the end of the prophetic office long after the cessation of the prophetic office in the book of Malachi. And I don't mean by that Daniel was written after Malachi. I don't mean that at all. I'm simply saying that his prophecy foretold of the cessation of the prophetic office after the writing of Malachi. Do you follow me there? So, what we're going to do is we're going to build on that. Daniel chapter 9, 70 weeks are determined to seal vision and prophecy. But we are concerned here, are we not, with Sukkot. Well, what is Sukkot? Time of the harvest. It's also the time of the new heaven and new earth. Because on the day after Sukkot, you have Shemini Atzerat, which anticipated, and Sukkot itself did, because it's the turning of the year. It's the end of the year, turning toward the new year. Not only did Daniel, chapter 9, 24, foretell the cessation of the miraculous office of prophet, he also foretold the bringing in of everlasting righteousness. Daniel 9:24. 70 weeks are determined to bring in everlasting righteousness. Now, very, very quickly, let me remind you that last week I pointed out that in the narrative of the Old Testament, to be unrighteousness was to be cast out of the presence of the Lord. It was to be cast out from before his face. To be righteous before God was to dwell before his face. It was to have his face to shine upon you. Numbers chapter 6, verse 24. And now the Lord bless you and keep you and cause his face to shine upon you. Do you see the interplay here between righteousness, being pleasing to God, and this concept of dwelling in the face, in the presence of the Lord? Now, I'm going to document this even more as we continue, but this is so important to see. Unrighteousness, being unrighteous, was to be cast out of the presence, the prosopon, that's the Greek word used in the Septuagint to speak of the face of the Lord. So to dwell in the face of the Lord was to be righteous. Boy, where to go with this? There's so much to say here. To be unrighteous was to be cast out of the presence, the face of the Lord. So Daniel chapter 9 foretold the end, the end of the charismata at the arrival of the everlasting world of righteousness. When would that be? We'll investigate that on the flip side. See you there.